The late afternoon sun, a weak and watery gold, filtered through the ancient oaks lining the street, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the pavement like skeletal fingers. I drove slowly, my hands resting lightly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel of my sedan, a vehicle chosen for its comfort and anonymity, not for the thrill of the drive. That had been Eleanor's domain. A box wrapped in simple brown paper sat on the passenger seat beside me, containing a small collection of her porcelain music boxes, items I had finally found the strength to sort through. I had decided David, our son, should have them. It was an impromptu visit, a sudden need to connect, to feel the continuity of family in a world that had felt fractured and hollow since her passing just over a year ago. The house he shared with his wife, Clara, was a handsome colonial, a house I had helped them secure the down payment for, a fact that had once been a source of quiet paternal pride. Now, as I turned onto their street, a different feeling began to coalesce in my chest, a vague, formless anxiety that had become an unwelcome companion in my grief. It was a premonition without a subject, a low hum of dissonance in the quiet symphony of my life. Then I saw it, parked not in their driveway, but a few feet beyond their pristine white gate, tucked partially behind a sprawling azalea bush as if in a half-hearted attempt at concealment. It was unmistakable. A 1971 Mercedes-Benz 280 SL, painted a deep cerulean blue, a color Eleanor had called the color of the sky just before a storm. It was her car, her pride, her joy, the one extravagance she had ever allowed herself. My heart gave a painful lurch, a sudden, violent kick against my ribs. This was impossible. The car had been sold 6 months ago. David had handled the sale, citing the painful memories it held for me and the impracticality of maintaining such a classic vehicle. He had presented me with the paperwork, the bill of sale to a collector in another state, and a cashier's check that had gone directly into a trust for their future children. I remembered his somber, dutiful expression, the way Clara had placed a comforting hand on my arm, telling me it was for the best, that it was what his mother would have wanted. It had all been so clean, so logical, so considerate. Yet there it was. The chrome bumper gleamed with a familiar brilliance, a small, almost imperceptible scratch just above the right headlamp, a memento from a long-ago misadventure with a rogue shopping cart that Eleanor had always refused to have repaired, calling it a mark of character. My mind, an architect's mind trained to see structures, systems, and a logical flow from foundation to rooftop, could not reconcile the two realities. The car was here, yet the car was sold. One of these facts was a lie. A cold dread, far sharper and more defined than the earlier anxiety, began to seep into me. I did not pull into their driveway. Instead, I continued past the house, my gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the cerulean blue shape shrink until it was just a speck of impossible color. I parked 3 houses down, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The music boxes and their brown paper wrapping seemed to mock me from the passenger seat, relics of a shared history that was suddenly in question. I needed to understand. The impulse was not emotional, it was structural. A load-bearing wall in my reality had just developed a hairline crack, and I needed to know if it was cosmetic or if the entire edifice was about to collapse. I got out of my car, leaving the box behind. I walked back toward their house, keeping to the opposite side of the street, using the cover of the manicured hedges and mature trees that lined the sidewalk. The afternoon was quiet, the air still and heavy with the scent of cut grass and blooming gardenias. As I drew closer, I noticed a window on the ground floor was open, the one to David's home office. Voices drifted out, faint but distinct in the suburban stillness. His voice and Clara's. I slowed my pace, my heart a heavy, rhythmic drum against the silence. There was no rational reason for me to be skulking outside my own son's home, yet every instinct I possessed screamed at me to stay hidden, to listen. I slipped behind the thick trunk of an oak tree directly across from the open window, the rough bark pressing into my back. The angle was poor, but the air was so still that their words carried across the lawn with a terrible clarity. "He almost saw it," Clara was saying, her voice sharp, stripped of the warmth and deference she always used with me. You have to be more careful, David. Leaving on the street is just idiotic. What if he had decided to pop over unannounced? There was a beat of silence. Then David's reply, laced with an exasperated weariness that I had never heard him direct at her before. It was the mechanic, all right. He dropped it off an hour early. I was on a conference call. What was I supposed to do? Tell him to take it back? The carburetor was rebuilt. It needed to be done. We can't sell it if it runs like a tractor. Sell it. The words hung in the air, a second confirmation of the lie. They hadn't sold it. They were planning to sell it. The check they had given me, the one from the collector, had been a fabrication, a piece of theater. But for where had they gotten the money? My mind raced, connecting points with horrifying speed. The trust one had set up after Eleanor's death, the one I had made David a co-signer on to teach him financial responsibility, the sudden and significant withdrawals he had explained away as seed money for a new tech venture, a can't-miss opportunity that he had assured me was a safe bet. I had been so proud of his ambition, so eager to support him in the wake of our shared loss. Now, I saw the truth with brutal clarity. He had used my money, our money, Eleanor's money, to pay me for a car he had never sold. He had stolen from the estate to create the illusion of a legitimate transaction, all while keeping the asset for himself. A wave of nausea washed over me, so profound that I had to place a hand against the tree to steady myself. But the worst was yet to come. The car is the least of our problems, Clara continued, her tone shifting from irritation to cold strategy. We need to focus on the final push. My contacts at the firm have reviewed the petition. As long as we have Dr. Morrison's assessment and your testimony, the judge will almost certainly grant a temporary conservatorship. The key is to frame it as a loving son concerned for his grieving father's erratic behavior. My blood ran cold. A petition. A conservatorship. They were planning to have me declared incompetent. The small, helpful suggestions Clara had been making for months suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Her advice to consolidate my investment accounts for simpler management, her casual questions about my memory, her insistence that I was overwhelmed and needed to let them handle the complexities of the estate. It had not been help. It had been reconnaissance. They were building a case against my mind. Are you sure about this, Clara? David asked, and for a fleeting moment, a sliver of hope pierced my despair. Perhaps he had a conscience. Perhaps this was her plan, and he was merely a reluctant passenger. That hope was extinguished by his next words. It just feels like a huge risk. What if he fights it? What if he gets his own lawyer? His concern was not moral. It was tactical. He was not worried about betraying his father. He was worried about getting caught. Clara's laugh was a dry, brittle sound, utterly devoid of humor. Fight it with what? David, he trusts us. He trusts you. He's a brilliant architect, but when it comes to people, he's a child. He still thinks the world is built on handshakes and good faith. By the time he realizes what's happening, I'll have him so tied up in legal knots he won't be able to sign his own name without my approval. We just need to stick to the timeline. Another 2 months. We document every time he forgets a name, every time he seems withdrawn. We build the narrative. Then we file. Once we have control, we can liquidate everything quietly. The houses, the portfolio, all of it will be set for life. I stood frozen behind the tree, the world narrowing to the space between my ears where their voices echoed. Set for life. This was the motive, the foundation of their entire monstrous design. It was not a momentary lapse in judgment or a desperate act born of financial hardship. It was a cold, calculated, long-term conspiracy to strip me of everything I'd built, everything Eleanor and I had saved, and to discard me like a piece of obsolete machinery. The grief I felt was a physical thing, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle my knees. It was not just the loss of my son, but the horrifying realization that the son I had loved and trusted had never truly existed. He was a performance, a carefully constructed role played for my benefit, and the final act was my own destruction. My hand, trembling with a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice water in my veins, reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers, clumsy with shock, found a voice memo application. I pressed the red button. I began to record. I needed proof. I needed a weapon. In that moment, standing in the shadow of an oak tree, listening to my son and his wife plot my ruin, the grieving father died, and something else, something harder and far more methodical, was born. I let the recording run for another 5 minutes, capturing every damning detail of their timeline, their manufactured evidence, their contemptuous dismissal of my intelligence. When Clara mentioned needing to get ready for a dinner reservation, I knew my time was limited. I stopped the recording, saved the file under a meaningless string of numbers, and backed it up to a secure cloud server I used for my architectural blueprints. My mind was working with a strange, detached clarity, the emotional storm within me, contained by the sudden, urgent need for a plan. I could not confront them now. To do so would be to show my hand, to give them the chance to adapt, to destroy evidence, to accelerate their timeline. No, the architect in me knew that a premature move could bring the whole structure down on my own head. I had to proceed with caution, with precision, with a blueprint for their undoing that was as detailed and flawless as any I had ever designed for a building. I forced my legs to move, to carry me away from the tree, away from the open window. I walked back to my car, my steps measured in even a portrait of calm that was a complete fabrication. I got in, placed my phone on the passenger seat, and stared at the brown paper package. The music boxes, a gift from a loving father to his beloved son. The irony was so bitter it felt like acid in my throat. I started the car, my movements stiff and robotic. I would not go home. I could not face the empty house, the gallery of photographs that were now monuments to a lie. I needed to think, to plan. But first, I had to complete the first step of my counter-operation. I had to see them. I had to look them in the eye and give the performance of my life. I drove back down the street, turned into their driveway, and parked behind Clara's sleek, black SUV. I picked up the box, took a deep breath to steady the tremor in my hands, and walked to their front door. The architect was about to conduct a site inspection of the lives he was preparing to condemn. I rang the doorbell. The cheerful, melodic chimes were a grotesque counterpoint to the turmoil in my soul. A few moments later, the door swung open and there was David, his face a mask of pleasant surprise. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I didn't know you were coming," he smiled. The same easy, charming smile he had used since he was a boy, the one that had always melted his mother's heart and filled me with such pride. Now, seeing it up close, I could detect the subtle mechanics of it, the slight crinkle around the eyes that did not quite reach their depths, the practiced lift of the corners of his mouth. It was a well-rehearsed expression, not a genuine emotion. "I was in the neighborhood," I said, my voice sounding unervingly normal, a testament to some deep reservoir of self-control I hadn't known I possessed. "I was clearing out another of your mother's old chests and found these. I thought you should have them." I held out the box. "Oh, Dad, you shouldn't have," he said, taking the package. He ushered me inside, calling over his shoulder, "Clara, look who's here." She emerged from the hallway, a vision of professional grace in a silk blouse and tailored trousers. Her smile was even more polished than David's, her eyes wide with feigned delight. "Arthur, this is a wonderful surprise. We were just about to head out for dinner, but we have time for a drink. Please come in, sit down." She was the perfect hostess, her every gesture designed to convey warmth and welcome. I allowed myself to be led into their living room, a space decorated with impeccable, minimalist taste, a room so devoid of personal clutter it felt more like a showroom than home. I sat on a firm, uncomfortable sofa, the very picture of an unsuspecting father, while they moved around me, their actions a seamless ballet of deception. Clara poured me a small glass of whiskey, her movements fluid and confident. As she handed it to me, I looked directly into her eyes and summoned the memory of her voice from the recording, the cold, dismissive tone as she had called me a child. "Thank you, Clara," I said, my voice steady. "You two are always so good to me." I watched for a reaction, a flicker of guilt, a moment of hesitation, but there was nothing. Her composure was absolute. She was a professional, and this, I realized, was her most important case. David sat in the armchair opposite me, the box of music boxes on the table beside him. "We're happy to, Dad," he said, his expression one of earnest filial duty. "Especially now. We worry about you, rattling around in that big house all by yourself." It was a line from their script, a foundation stone for their narrative of my decline. They were testing it, seeing how it landed. I took a sip of the whiskey, the fiery liquid a welcome shock to my system. I had a probe. I needed to hear them lie to my face, to gather more data, to understand the full scope of their duplicity. I leaned back, feigning a casual, nostalgic air. I began swirling the amber liquid in my glass. Driving over here, I had the strangest feeling. For a second, I thought I saw your mother's old Mercedes parked down the street. It was the exact same color. I let the sentence hang in the air, a baited hook. I watched them closely, observing them as I would stress test on a new building material. David's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. Clara's posture stiffened for a fraction of a second before she relaxed again, a masterful display of control. It was David who answered, his laugh a little too quick, a little too loud. "That's funny. There are a few classic car enthusiasts around here. Probably just a coincidence. We sold Mom's car months ago. To that collector in Oregon, remember?" Of course, I said, nodding slowly. The paperwork was all in order. A Mr. Harrison, wasn't it? It was a fleeting thing. Grief plays tricks on the mind. I suppose I was feeding them their own narrative, reinforcing their belief in my vulnerability. Clara seized the opportunity, her expression softening into one of deep, fraudulent concern. "That's exactly it, Arthur. It's completely normal. Your mind is trying to process an enormous loss. Sometimes it means seeing things that aren't there or feeling a little forgetful. It's why, David, and I want you to know you can lean on us for anything. Anything at all." Her voice was a silken trap, every word a carefully placed thread in the web they were weaving around me. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred, so intense it was dizzying. But I pushed it down, burying it deep beneath the facade of the sad, aging father. I had to maintain the illusion. My survival depended on it. Before I left, I deployed my first small piece of psychological ordnance. I stood up, feigning a weariness I did not feel. "Well, I should let you get to your dinner. Thank you for the drink." As they walked me to the door, I paused in the entryway, looking back toward the office. "It's a good thing I rang the bell," I said, my tone light and conversational. "I noticed your study window was wide open when I walked up. On a quiet day like today, you could probably hear every word from the street. You should be more careful with client confidentiality." Clara, I did not look directly at them. I focused on a point on the wall, just past David's shoulder, as if the thought had just occurred to me. But in my peripheral vision, I saw it. The shared panic glance, the sudden, rigid stillness in their bodies, the instantaneous evaporation of their practiced ease. I had planted a seed of doubt, a tiny, poisonous spore of paranoia that would now fester in the dark corners of their conspiracy. They would wonder, had I heard? How much had I heard? I had turned their secure fortress into a house of whispers. I said my goodbyes, embracing my son, the physical contact a vile necessity. His body felt stiff and unnatural in my arms. I nodded politely to Clara, meeting her sharp, analytical gaze with one of my own, carefully clouded with a veneer of tired confusion. I walked to my car, got in, and drove away, not looking back. The mask of the grieving, slightly befuddled father remained in place until I was several miles away, until the familiar landmarks of their neighborhood had been replaced by the anonymous thoroughfares of the city. Then, and only then, did I pull over into a deserted parking lot, switch off the engine, and let out a single, ragged breath. The tremor in my hands returned, more violent this time. The sheer, calculated cruelty of their plan was breathtaking. They were not just trying to steal my money. They were trying to steal my life, my memories, my very identity. They were trying to erase me. The rage returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a hot, chaotic inferno. It was a cold, controlled burn, a forge in which a new and terrible resolve was being tempered. They thought I was a relic, a fragile structure from a bygone era, ready to be demolished. They were about to discover that I was the architect of their ruin, and I had just completed the preliminary survey. The foundation of their world was rotten, and I was going to bring the entire thing crashing down. The drive home was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every street corner, every park, every familiar building seemed to hold a memory of Eleanor, of David as a child, of our family as I had believed it to be. The past was no longer a source of comfort. It was a vast and intricate lie I had unknowingly inhabited. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, the house loomed before me, a magnificent Tudor I had designed myself 30 years ago. It had been my masterpiece, a testament to permanence, to the enduring strength of family. Now, it felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a deception. I walked through the front door into the grand foyer, the scent of lemon oil and old books, a scent I had always associated with home, now smelling of decay. The silence was absolute, a heavy, pressing weight. On the mahogany console table, there was a silver-framed photograph of the four of us, myself, Eleanor, teenage David, and his younger sister, Amelia, taken on a family vacation 2 decades ago. We were all smiling, caught in a moment of what I had thought was pure, unadulterated happiness. I looked at David's face, at his youthful, carefree grin, and I searched for the seed of the man he would become. Was it there? Had I missed it? Had my love for him been a blinder, obscuring the truth that was right in front of me? I left the photograph and walked into my study, the heart of the house, the room where I'd spent countless hours drafting designs, building models, creating worlds out of paper and ink. It had always been my sanctuary. Tonight, it would become my war room. I sat down in my worn leather chair, the one molded to the shape of my body over thousands of hours of work. I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the gathering darkness, the city lights beginning to twinkle through the large bay window, and I allowed the pain to wash over me. It was a grief sharper and more profound than what I had felt when Eleanor died. Her death had been a tragedy of nature, a cruel but understandable turn of fate. This was a tragedy of character, a betrayal so fundamental it called into question everything I had ever believed about love, loyalty, and family. I thought of Eleanor, of her fierce, unwavering love for our son. She had always made excuses for him, smoothed over his mistakes, celebrated his minor triumphs as if they were historic achievements. Had her love blinded her, too? Or had she, on some level, known? The thought was an agony, a fresh wound laid open on top of the others. Had she died with the secret knowledge of our son's defective heart? I prayed she had not. I prayed she had been spared this particular torment. For hours, I replayed memories, examining them like an archaeologist brushing dirt from ancient pottery, searching for the true shape beneath the accumulated grime of deception. I remembered David's university days, the constant, urgent requests for money to cover unexpected expenses, a broken laptop, a research trip, a rent shortfall. Eleanor and I had always provided it without question, believing we were investing in his future. I now saw it as the beginning of a long and successful career in defrauding his own parents. I remembered the period after he married Clara, the subtle shift in his attitude. He became more critical of my financial decisions, more inquisitive about the details of our estate. He and Clara had presented it as responsible planning, as wanting to be prepared to help should anything happen to me or his mother. They had used the language of love and concern to mask the cold calculus of avarice. Every gift, every holiday dinner, every expression of affection was now tainted, recontextualized as a strategic move in their long game. They were not family. They were prospectors, patiently waiting to stake their claim on my life's work. Sometime after midnight, the storm of grief began to subside. The waves of pain receded, leaving behind a shoreline of cold, hard clarity. The emotional devastation had scoured me clean, leaving only the bedrock of my intellect, my training, my nature. I was an architect. I did not surrender to chaos. I imposed order upon it. I did not weep over a flawed design. I corrected it. David and Clara had made a critical miscalculation. They had mistaken my love for weakness, my trust for naivete. They saw me as a sentimental old fool, a relic to be managed and ultimately disposed of. They had failed to understand that the same mind that could design a skyscraper, that could balance the immense complexities of physics, materials, and human need, could also be turned to a task of deconstruction. The grief was not gone, but it was no longer a debilitating force. It had been transmuted, reforged into fuel. I would not simply defend myself against their attack. I would launch a counteroffensive so precise, so methodical, and so devastating that they would be left with nothing. I would not just protect my assets. I would dismantle their lives brick by stolen brick. I stood up and switched on the large lamp on my desk, flooding the room with bright, clean light. The time for mourning was over. The time for architecture had begun. My study, my former sanctuary, transformed itself into a command center. I cleared the large mahogany desk of its sentimental clutter, photographs, paperweights, a fountain pen gifted by Eleanor, and replaced them with the tools of my new trade. Laptops, legal pads, external hard drives, and a high-resolution scanner. I spent the first night and the following day in a state of focused, almost manic energy, fueled by coffee and a righteous fury. I began by creating a new, encrypted digital folder system, a fortress for the information I was about to gather. The first file I placed within it was the audio recording, now labeled with a complex alphanumeric code. It was my cornerstone, the single, unshakable piece of evidence upon which my entire case would be built. From there, I began the painstaking process of assembling the raw materials for my counteroffensive. I pulled out decades of financial records, bank statements, investment portfolios, tax returns, deeds, and trust documents. I scanned every single page, creating a digital archive that was both comprehensive and easily searchable. I was constructing a complete financial biography of my family, and I knew that somewhere within that mountain of data, I would find the subtle anomalies, the hairline cracks that would betray the full extent of their long-running fraud. The next morning, I made my first strategic move. I did not call a lawyer. Not yet. A lawyer would operate within the established rules of engagement, and I was not yet ready to be constrained by legal formalities. My first call was to Michael, my accountant for over 30 years. He was a man of meticulous habits and unimpeachable integrity, a man who viewed a balanced ledger with an almost religious reverence. I told him I was conducting a personal financial security review and that I needed a complete, deep-dive forensic audit of every account, trust, and transaction connected to my name, Eleanor's name, or David's name for the past 10 years. I did not give him the full story. I framed it as a proactive measure against potential external fraud, a story he accepted without question, though I could hear the curiosity in his voice. "This will be extensive, Arthur," he warned me. "It will take time, and it will be expensive, whatever it takes, Michael," I replied, my voice calm and firm. "Spare no expense. I need to see the complete, unvarnished truth of where every dollar has gone." He promised to begin immediately. My second call was to a man named Thomas Sterling, a former police detective who now ran a discreet private investigation agency. We had met years ago on a zoning board committee. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a cynical understanding of human nature that I now desperately needed. I hired him for two tasks. First, to conduct a comprehensive background check on Clara, focusing on her professional history and any financial irregularities. Second, to begin surveillance on both her and David. I wanted to know who they met with, where they went, and what they were spending money on. "This sounds personal, Arthur," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. "It is," I answered. "Treat it with the utmost discretion." While my professional allies began their work, I turned my attention to another front, my daughter, Amelia. She was 2 years younger than David, a clinical psychologist living on the other side of the country. Our relationship was solid, built on mutual respect and a shared intellectual curiosity, but it lacked the fraught emotional complexity of my bond with David. Amelia was pragmatic, analytical, and possessed a professional's aversion to drama and manipulation. I knew David and Clara would eventually try to recruit her, to use her as a pawn in their campaign to paint me as mentally unstable. I had to preempt them. I had to arm her with the truth before they could poison her with their lies. I wrestled with the decision. To tell her would be to destroy her image of her brother, to shatter the remaining foundations of her family. But not to tell her would be to leave her vulnerable, to risk her being turned against me. I decided that the truth, however brutal, was the only solid ground to stand on. The call would have to wait, however. I needed more than just the recording. I needed the irrefutable data from the audit, the damning information from the investigator. When I presented my case to Amelia, it had to be overwhelming, unassailable, and presented with the cold, hard logic she would understand and respect. Days turned into a week. I barely slept, subsisting on a diet of coffee and cold sandwiches eaten at my desk. The house grew dusty around me. The mail piled up in the foyer. The garden began to show the first signs of neglect. I was completely immersed in my project. Michael, my accountant, began sending encrypted daily reports. The picture they painted was horrifying. He uncovered a systematic pattern of siphoning, small but regular transfers from joint accounts to David's personal accounts, disguised as reimbursements for household expenses or payments to non-existent vendors. He found evidence that David had used his position as a co-signer on the trust to secure a personal line of credit, which he had then maxed out. The can't-miss tech venture he had taken money for was a phantom. The funds had vanished into a series of untraceable online accounts. The total amount stolen was staggering, far more than I had imagined. It was a slow, methodical bleed, a financial parasitism that had been going on for years, likely since before Eleanor had even fallen ill. Then came the report from Thomas Sterling, the private investigator. His findings on Clara were even more explosive. She had a history. 2 prior clients at her prestigious law firm had filed formal complaints against her with the state bar, alleging unethical billing practices and conflicts of interest. In both cases, the firm had settled quickly and quietly, and the complaints had been withdrawn before any formal investigation could be launched. She was not just an accomplice. She was a predator in her own right, with a demonstrated history of exploiting positions of trust for financial gain. The background check also uncovered a mountain of hidden debt. Clara and David were living far beyond their means, propping up their lavish lifestyle with credit cards, personal loans, and, as I now knew, my money. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. Their entire world was a house of cards, financed by fraud and deception. This was their vulnerability. This was the pressure point I could use to shatter their entire enterprise. With this new information, the final pieces of my blueprint began to fall into place. I now had the motive, the method, and the means. The phase of intelligence gathering was nearing its end. The counteroffensive was about to begin. The first strike had to be decisive and executed with surgical precision. Acting on the advice of a new lawyer, a hardened, no-nonsense litigator recommended by Michael, who I had finally brought into my confidence, I made a series of swift, coordinated moves. On a Tuesday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, when the banks opened, my lawyer filed a series of legal injunctions. The first was a freeze on every joint account I shared with David, citing a formal investigation into suspected fraudulent activity. The second was the placement of an immediate and undeniable lien against the vehicle identification number of Eleanor's Mercedes-Benz, legally preventing its sale or transfer of ownership. The third was a formal notification sent to the trustees of Eleanor's estate, of which I was the primary, alerting them to a pending legal challenge regarding the gross mismanagement of funds by a co-signer, effectively paralyzing David's access to any further capital from that source. Within the space of 15 minutes, I had severed all of their financial lifelines. I had cut off their supply of oxygen. Now, I would simply wait and watch them suffocate. It took less than 3 hours for the panic to set in. My phone rang, and the caller ID displayed David's name. I let it ring 4 times, a small act of psychological warfare, before answering with a calm, slightly distracted, "Hello, Dad, what the hell is going on?" His voice was high-pitched, strained with a frantic energy he could not conceal. My credit card was just declined at the gas station. I called the bank, and they said, "You've frozen our joint account." They said you filed something about fraud. What is this? I feigned a tone of deep, paternal concern. Frozen? Good heavens, David, are you serious? The bank must have detected some sort of external breach. I've been worried about identity theft. Thank God their security systems are working. This is a good thing. It means they're protecting our money. We need to go down there together and sort this out immediately. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had taken his accusation and reframed it as a shared crisis, positioning myself as his ally against an unknown external threat. I had completely upended his script. He was prepared for a confrontation, for an argument, for denial. He was not prepared for my cheerful, helpful cooperation. But they said you initiated it, he stammered, his confusion palpable. Well, of course I had to confirm my identity when they called me about the suspicious activity. I lied smoothly. They flagged a series of unusual withdrawals over the past few months. I told them I hadn't authorized them, so they locked everything down as a precaution. Don't you worry, son. We'll get to the bottom of this. I've already got my accountant looking into it. I could almost hear the frantic calculations happening in his head as he tried to process this new, unexpected variable. I had seized control of the narrative, and he was completely wrong-footed. An hour later, Claire called. Her approach was different, less frantic, more strategic. She was the lawyer, after all. Arthur, she began, her voice a carefully modulated blend of professional calm and personal concern. David just told me about the bank accounts. I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding. There is no need to take such drastic, formal measures. If you have concerns, you should have come to us directly. We could have reviewed the statements together. Filing a fraud claim is a very serious step, and it can create all sorts of unnecessary legal complications. She was trying to de-escalate, to pull the situation back from the formal, legal arena where she knew she was vulnerable, and into the informal, personal realm where she could use manipulation and emotional appeals. I was not about to let that happen. Clara, I appreciate your perspective, I said, my tone one of polite but firm resolve. But we're talking about a significant amount of money here. This is no longer a family matter. It is a financial and legal one. My accountant is already conducting a full forensic audit. Once he has identified the source of the breach, we will turn all the information over to the authorities. I am simply following professional advice to protect the estate. I use her own language, professional advice, forensic audit authorities, to build a wall of legitimacy around my actions. I was no longer just a grieving father. I was a client, an executor, a plaintiff. I had changed the rules of the game, and she knew it. The silence on her end of the line was heavy with unspoken fury. I see, she finally said, her voice now stripped of all its manufactured warmth, leaving only a cold, hard edge. You are making a mistake, Arthur. The only mistake, I replied, would be to do nothing. I ended the call. The first battle had been won. They were now financially isolated, trapped in a cage of my own design, and consumed by a paranoia I had so carefully planted. Their confusion and fear were palpable, a satisfying first return on my investment in revenge. Thomas Sterling's surveillance reports became my daily reading. They painted a vivid picture of my son and daughter-in-law's escalating panic. There were hushed, frantic phone calls made from parked cars. There were tense, joyless meals at expensive restaurants where they barely spoke, picking at their food while their eyes darted around the room. There were late-night trips to ATMs, their cards repeatedly declined. The reports also documented a series of meetings at a different law firm, a boutique practice specializing in elder law and probate litigation. Thomas had managed to identify the lead attorney, a man notorious for his aggressive, scorched-earth tactics in competency hearings. They were not backing down. They were doubling down. They were preparing to execute their original plan, to file the petition for conservatorship, but now would be framed not as a preemptive act of concern, but as a desperate response to my erratic and paranoid financial actions. They were going to use the very trap I had set for them as evidence against me. It was a bold, vicious move, and I had to admire the sheer audacity of it, even as it filled me with a cold dread. They were coming for my freedom, and they were coming fast. The next phase of their plan became clear when I received a call from my daughter. Amelia's voice was tight, with a carefully controlled tension. "Dad, I just had the strangest conversation with David. I braced myself. This was it. He called me this morning, she continued, and he sounded frantic. He told me that you've been acting erratically, that you've frozen their accounts and are making wild accusations about fraud. He said he and Clara are worried you're having some sort of breakdown, that your grief is causing you to become paranoid and delusional. The words were straight from their playbook, a well-rehearsed script designed to poison her against me, to recruit her as a character witness for my supposed mental decline. David had tried to manipulate his sister, to leverage her professional expertise as a psychologist to validate his claims. It was a calculated, cynical move, and it was a profound misreading of his sister's character. He told me they're considering legal action. Amelia said, her voice dropping lower, for your own protection. I want to know if I had noticed any signs of cognitive decline in our recent conversations. He asked me if I would be willing to speak to his lawyer, to provide a professional opinion on your mental state. She paused, and I could hear the anger and disgust simmering beneath her calm, professional tone. He was trying to get me to help him have you declared incompetent, wasn't he? My daughter was no one's fool. Her training had given her a finely tuned antenna for manipulation and coercion, and David's clumsy, desperate attempt had set off every alarm bell she possessed. Yes, Amelia, I said, my voice heavy. That is exactly what he was trying to do. I'm getting on the next flight, she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. I will be there tomorrow morning. We're going to handle this together. The relief that flooded through me was immense. I was not alone in this fight. I had an ally, and it was the one person whose loyalty and integrity were beyond question. When Amelia arrived the next day, I did not greet her with an emotional outburst or a rambling account of my grievances. I greeted her as a colleague, a consultant being brought in on a difficult case. I led her into my study, my war room, and I laid out the evidence with the dispassionate precision of an architect presenting a structural analysis. I started with the financial reports from Michael, the color-coded spreadsheets that detailed years of systematic theft. I showed her the private investigators' reports on Clara's professional misconduct and their mountain of hidden debt. I laid out the timeline of their actions, from the fake sale of the car to their recent meetings with the conservatorship lawyer. I presented it as a case study, a methodical deconstruction of a criminal enterprise. Amelia listened in silence, her psychologist's eyes missing nothing, her expression a mask of intense concentration. She read every document, absorbed every detail, her sharp mind piecing together the narrative of greed and betrayal. When I had finished, she looked at me, her face pale but her gaze steady. It's all there, she said quietly. The motive, the means, the opportunity. It's a classic case of narcissistic exploitation and antisocial behavior. She was processing it not just as a daughter, but as a professional, categorizing their pathology, putting a name to their monstrosity. Then, for the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, I swiveled my computer monitor toward her and I played the recording. I watched her face as the voices of her brother and sister-in-law filled the quiet study, their words dripping with contempt and cold-blooded calculation. I saw the last vestiges of sisterly affection in her eyes curdle into a look of profound horror and disillusionment. When the recording ended, she sat in silence for a full minute, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then she looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a cold, hard fire that mirrored my own. "What's our next move?" she asked. The word "our" was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The alliance was forged. With Amelia now firmly in my corner, we moved to preempt their next attack. My lawyer, a brilliant and aggressive woman named Margaret, drafted a letter based on the information Thomas Sterling had uncovered about Clara's past professional conduct. It was a masterpiece of veiled threats and legalistic intimidation. The letter was sent not to Clara, but to the managing partners of her law firm and, simultaneously, to the Ethics Committee of the State Bar Association. It did not make direct accusations. Instead, it formally expressed grave concern over a pattern of predatory and unethical behavior by one of their senior associates, Clara, specifically in relation to her conduct regarding the estate of my late wife. It hinted at a forthcoming lawsuit that would name not only Clara but the firm itself as a defendant, citing their negligent supervision, which had enabled her to exploit a vulnerable, grieving family. It was a declaration of war, delivered not to the soldier on the field, but directly to her commanding officers. It was designed to trigger an immediate internal investigation, to turn her greatest source of strength, her professional standing, into her most profound vulnerability. Her career was now in the crosshairs, and her own partners would be the ones pulling the trigger. The dominoes were beginning to fall. The final confrontation was scheduled for a sterile, impersonal courtroom on a gray Thursday morning. David and Clara had filed their emergency petition for conservatorship, and the court had granted a preliminary hearing. They walk into the courtroom with an air of practiced solemnity, Clara in a severe navy blue suit, a portrait of legal professionalism, and David in a dark gray suit, his face a mask of sorrowful concern. They were flanked by their lawyer, the notorious attack dog, a man whose smug expression suggested he believed this to be a simple, open-and-shut case. I sat at the respondents' table with Margaret and Amelia. I felt a strange sense of calm, the tranquility of an architect on the day of a demolition, knowing that all the charges have been perfectly placed, all the calculations meticulously checked. All that remained was to push the button. Their lawyer called David to the stand first. He was a masterful performer. He spoke in a soft, trembling voice, his eyes welling with crocodile tears as he described my heartbreaking decline since Eleanor's death. He recounted fabricated incidents of me forgetting important appointments, of making wild, paranoid accusations against him and his wife, of my reckless and impulsive decision to freeze their accounts. He painted a picture of a loving, desperate son, forced to take this terrible legal step for his own father's protection. "I love my father," he said, his voice cracking with feigned emotion as he looked toward the judge. "All I want is to protect him from himself, to manage his affairs, so he can live out his years in peace and security. It's what my mother would have wanted. It was a sickeningly perfect performance, and I could see the judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, looking at me with a glimmer of pity. Clara sat at her table, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the supportive, heartbroken daughter-in-law to perfection. When it was Margaret's turn to cross-examine, she approached the stand not with aggression, but with a quiet, almost sympathetic air. She asked David a series of simple, clarifying questions, having him confirm the details of his testimony. "So, Mr. Evans, your primary concern is your father's financial well-being, which you believe is at risk due to his current mental state?" "Yes, that's correct," David said earnestly. "And you believe his accusations of fraud against you and your wife are a symptom of his paranoia?" "Yes. It breaks my heart, but yes. And you maintain that all of your financial dealings with your father's estate have been transparent and for his benefit?" "Absolutely," David said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "Every single one." Margaret paused, letting his answer hang in the silent courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the judge, "I have one piece of evidence I would like to play for the court. It is an audio recording that I believe speaks directly to the plaintiff's true motivations and his concern for his father's well-being." David and Clara's lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection. We have no knowledge of this recording. It's inadmissible. It was captured by my client in a public space where there was no reasonable expectation of privacy," Margaret countered smoothly. "And it is being offered as rebuttal evidence to impeach the witness's testimony. It is directly relevant to his credibility." The judge looked intrigued. "I'll allow it," she said, her voice firm. "Proceed." A clerk brought a speaker and connected it to Margaret's laptop. David's eyes darted nervously between Margaret and Clara, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. Clara was perfectly still, her face a pale, frozen mask, but I could see the frantic pulse beating in her throat. Margaret pressed a key on her laptop, and then their voices filled the courtroom. Clara's sharp, irritated tone complaining about the car. David's exasperated reply about the mechanic. And then the damning words, clear and undeniable, about the petition, the conservatorship Dr. Morrison's assessment, and the plan to have me declared incompetent. The courtroom was utterly silent, save for the recorded sound of their conspiracy. I watched their faces. The color drained from David's cheeks, leaving a pasty, grayish pallor. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. Clara's professional mask shattered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury, directed not at me, but at David, at his stupidity, at his carelessness. And then came the final, brutal lines of the recording, Clara's voice, cold and clinical, laying out the plan to liquidate everything once they had control, to be set for life. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was a physical presence. Every eye was on David and Clara. David was visibly trembling on the witness stand, his mouth slightly agape, his well-rehearsed composure completely gone. The judge stared at them, her face a thunderous mask of contempt. She looked from their horrified faces to me, and the pity in her eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard respect. She turned her glare back to David. "Mr. Evans," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "do you have anything to say in light of this evidence?" David could only shake his head, incapable of speech. The judge's gaze shifted to Clara, then to their lawyer, who looked as though he had been poleaxed. "Petition for conservatorship is dismissed with extreme prejudice," the judge declared, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom like the crack of a gavel. "I find that this petition was not only without merit, but was filed in bad faith. For malicious and fraudulent purposes, she was not finished. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, I am referring this entire matter to the District Attorney's Office for immediate investigation into potential criminal charges, including but not limited to conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, and attempted elder abuse." She fixed Clara with a withering stare. "And a transcript of these proceedings, including that recording, will be sent to the State Bar Association. I imagine they will be very interested in your definition of professional ethics." Counselor was over. In the space of 5 minutes, their entire world had been annihilated. Checkmate. The epilogue of their lives was written not by me, but by the relentless machinery of the consequences they had set in motion. The District Attorney's Office moved with surprising speed. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of the recording and the mountain of financial data from Michael's audit, David pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and theft to avoid a longer, more humiliating trial. He was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, a sentence that shocked our old social circles and served as a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. Clara's fate was, in many ways, more complete in its destruction. The internal investigation at her firm, spurred by Margaret's letter and solidified by the judge's referral, resulted in her immediate termination. The State Bar Association, presented with a case of such blatant, premeditated malice against a vulnerable party, moved for disbarment. Her legal career, the source of her power and her arrogance, was over. Buried under a mountain of debt, with their primary source of illicit income gone and their professional lives in ruins, they were forced to sell their handsome colonial house at a loss to cover legal fees. The life they had conspired to steal from me was the very thing their conspiracy had cost them. I reclaimed Eleanor's cerulean blue Mercedes. I had it brought to a specialist, a master craftsman who lovingly restored its engine to a low, powerful hum and polished its paint until it shone with the depth of a summer sky. I did not drive it often, but sometimes on a clear autumn afternoon, I would take it out onto the winding country roads outside the city, the wind in my hair, the scent of leather and gasoline, a nostalgic perfume. It was no longer a symbol of betrayal, but a monument to resilience. I had taken back what was mine. My relationship with Amelia deepened, reforged in the crucible of the crisis. We spoke every week, our conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound. The shared trauma had stripped away any pretense, leaving behind a bond of pure, unshakable trust and mutual respect. She was the true inheritance Eleanor had left me, the enduring structure built on a foundation of integrity. My own life found a new, quieter rhythm. I took on fewer architectural projects, choosing only those that sparked a genuine passion, Designs that focused on creating spaces of peace and sanctuary, a library, a small concert hall, a meditation center. The fire of my rage had cooled, leaving not a scar of bitterness, but a quiet, detached sense of vindication. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not been broken. I had responded not with chaotic emotion, but with methodical precision. I had protected my life's work, honored my wife's memory, and restored a sense of order to my world. I had done what an architect does. I had identified a fatal structural flaw, and I had razed the compromised building to the ground, ensuring that nothing so rotten could ever be built on that foundation again. There was a melancholy peace in that knowledge, a grim satisfaction in a job well and truly done.